Good afternoon. I'm Stuart Patrick, Director of the Global Order and Institutions Program here at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this virtual meeting on the Summit of the Future. So a special welcome is in order for Guy Ryder, the United Nations Undersecretary-General for Policy, Jake Sherman, Minister Counselor of the U.S. Mission in the United Nations, and my Carnegie colleague and good friend, Minh Tu Pham. This September, the UN's 193 member states will convene in New York for what is ambitiously being christened a Summit of the Future. The stated purpose of this gathering is to rescue and revive international cooperation at a time of crisis, not only for the UN, but for the entire multilateral system. The summit is the brainchild of António Guterres. The Secretary-General calls it, quote, a once-in-a-generation opportunity to reinvigorate global action, recommit to fundamental principles, and develop the frameworks of multilateralism so that they're fit for the future. The sense of urgency is palpable and understandable. Great power competition and war have paralyzed the UN Security Council. Divisions between the world's North and South are widening. The global economy is fragmenting. Development gains are at risk. The climate emergency continues unabated, and transformative technologies are bringing in new risks. These centrifugal forces are tearing apart the normative fabric of world order. At the same time, there are centripetal forces that are pulling many peoples inward towards self-regarding populist nationalism or even narrower communities of identity and interest, accentuating global divisions. This September summit is an effort to arrest these trends by reminding member states of their fundamental obligations under the UN Charter, by updating multilateral machinery to today's world, and by hopefully galvanizing collective action on specific challenges. In September, member states will be asked to endorse a so-called Pact of the Future, intended as a blueprint for multilateral cooperation in the 21st century. The initial draft was released a month ago, and it includes sections on peace and security, the global financial system, new digital technologies, the rights of youth and of future generations, and reform of global governance architecture. So the intent of our conversation today is really to delve more deeply into the rationale and prospects for this undertaking. How can the summit and the Pact for the Future meet the moment? Towards that end, we'll take questions about these, towards the end of this program, we'll take some questions from the audience online. So please prepare and put your questions into the YouTube chat. So let me begin with Guy Ryder. First of all, many thanks for joining us today. I know you have a very busy schedule. Can you tell us a little bit more about the genesis and aspirations for the summit? What's at stake and why do this now at a very difficult time for international diplomacy?
Well, thank you, Stuart, and good afternoon to everybody. The genesis of the summit, I think, is to be found a few years back, 2020, the 75th anniversary of the United Nations, when member states came together, adopted a declaration with a number of very straightforward commitments in respect of the United Nations and the future of multilateralism. On the basis of that declaration, the Secretary-General was asked to make a series of proposals about how to give effect to those commitments. He produced a report, and it's sort of seminal in this whole process, called Our Common Agenda. That was further discussed, and on the basis of those discussions, he's produced a number of proposals, policy briefs so-called, about the substance of the issues that he has proposed in that Our Common Agenda report be submitted to a Summit of the Future. So that's the genesis, that's the process background, if you like, and it's pretty lengthy. Now, what's the rationale? The rationale, you've alluded to some of the key points in your introduction, Stuart. The first thing is, I think there is recognition that multilateral action and cooperation is faced by very considerable challenges at this moment. There are those who would describe the system as being in crisis. And I think there's a need for us to think in a serious way and a forward-looking way on how we need to adapt and to strengthen the multilateral system faced with those crises. You can take two views on this. One is that this is just firefighting. You know, there's a crisis here, a crisis there. In the normal way, the UN system just has to address them, pretty much as it's always done. or you can take the view that there are things which are more permanent, structural, far-reaching that need to be addressed. And I think it is the latter approach that animates the summit for the future. You've mentioned some of the crises. Climate change is getting ahead of our capacity to react to it. The Sustainable Development Goals, which we set back in 2015, are way off track. We're not capable of delivering on those goals. 15% is a success rate right now. Multiplying and deepening conflicts are out there. And the Security Council has had difficulty in addressing those conflicts in a way which I think meets the needs of the international community or people's expectations. And lastly, this world is changing very, very quickly. I mean, one thinks technology. There are emerging opportunities, but they're accompanied often by emerging challenges and risks. And we need to be able to deal with those, perhaps in ways that we don't have the tools to do on the basis of the existing toolbox. And this changing world, and it's my last point, Stuart, I mean, just think about it. When the UN was created and much of our continuing architecture was put in place, the United Nations had 51 member states. We have 193 member states. The world has changed. And I think it is important that our multilateral processes and structures reflect the realities of today's world, not the world of the 1940s. So all of these things, I think, animate the summit at a high level of ambition. Let us be clear. The Secretary-General, you're right, has talked about a once-in-a-generation opportunity. And you know, that does imply that we're not really tweaking the edges of this process. We're trying to deal with some essentials.
Can I pick up on that a little bit? The Secretary-General has framed this not simply as a UN reform effort, but in a sense as a broader reform of global governance. And that includes everything from, there are different components, peace and security. There are, I guess, 5 broad themes, right? Peace and security, international financial architecture, future generations, the rights of youth, technology. Some of those things are things that the UN actually has control over, and then others are really about the broader multilateral system as well. How does the UN square this circle where, on the one hand, it's asserting the need to reform the entire multilateral system, but on the other hand, it's about the centrality and the relevance of the United Nations itself? There are a number of proposals that would require the reform, for instance, of international financial institutions, which are not sort of in a direct sense under the purview of the United Nations. How does the Secretary-General and the Secretariat look at that problem?
Yeah, I think it's a very important question. I mean, there is a large amount of this agenda, the proposals that the Secretary-General's put to the summit, which belong firmly within the competencies of the UN. If you look at our peacekeeping operations, the new agenda for peace, which is an important part of the process. If you look also, I would say, at a lot of the technology issues, not entirely, but in great measure, this addresses what the UN is doing within its own system, whole of system, but within the system. But I think you're right to point to, and this comes out particularly in respect to the international financial architecture, the manner in which the Secretary-General's proposals do also have implications for organizations, institutions, which are outside the immediate UN system, and that is quite clear. Now, there is no illusion here. There is no illusion here. The United Nations Secretary-General is the Secretary-General of the United Nations, and that's where obviously his authority lies. But there are things which link us to the operations and functioning of institutions, which, whilst not a part of the United Nations, clearly affect and influence and condition the success of the United Nations in the objectives that we have set. So I think it is both legitimate and necessary that we talk to those linkages without falling into the trap of believing that decisions belong to the UN, which in fact belong in other places. And so, this is something which has to be kept constantly in mind. Secretary-General is, I think, very actively engaging dialogue with those external but related institutions. But clearly, they will have to take the day that this sort of materializes. They will have to take their decisions, and the authority will be where institutionally it properly belongs.
Great. I want to turn to Jake now. Could you share with us the U.S.'s priorities when it comes to the Summit of the Future, and thinking about your assessment of some of the issue areas that have been identified as important and as ingredients for the Pact for the Future, which is currently being negotiated and hopefully will be approved in the fall. What are some of the most important aspects of that document as you see it now?
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, I think there's a couple different categories of priorities, if you will. First and foremost, I mean, we see the summit and the Pact for the Future, the outcome document for the summit, as an opportunity to reaffirm many of the, in fact, all of the fundamental norms and values of the United Nations, from respect to the UN Charter, which we've seen a permanent member of the Security Council run roughshod over as we enter the third year of the war in Ukraine. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, I think, is another foundational document that is as important as ever. So that in that first category, how do we lift up and make sure that the foundational principles of the UN remain front and center. I think there's a second category that's about, and Guy spoke to this. We're facing untold crises in the world of various kinds, and I think we see the summit as a way of strengthening existing mandates, and in some cases actually providing new mandates to enable the UN to better address emerging challenges and opportunities. And in this category, I mean, we're looking at quite a few areas. We've been very supportive of the idea of a global digital compact that affirms an open, safe, rights-respecting internet and appropriately addresses artificial intelligence. The Secretary-General's put forward what he calls a new agenda for peace to try and strengthen the UN's peace and security architecture, from conflict prevention to peacekeeping to peace building. It also includes things like counterterrorism and responding to new threats like cyber threats and bio risks. So, within the new agenda, we've been very supportive of strengthening capacities for prevention and mediation, enhancing the role of the Peacebuilding Commission, looking at how we can strengthen responses to climate-related security risks. And I think we'd also be interested in one of the recommendations in the new agenda is to look at new models of peace operations. I think also in the category of new mandates, the SG floated the idea of an emergency platform, essentially a set of protocols that he could invoke the next time there is a global crisis, to enable the UN to better coordinate a response to that, whether it's a major pandemic or a massive natural disaster on the order of the 2004 tsunami. And we've been supportive of the idea of a voluntary code of conduct that increases access to reliable information without placing restrictions on freedom of expression. I mean, this is a year when half the population of the world is going to be voting in elections. So the importance of having access to reliable information. I think there's a third category, which in some cases we can use the summit to provide momentum for reforms that need to happen through ongoing processes, both in the UN or in some cases outside of the UN. And Security Council reform is arguably the most emblematic example of this. As Guy said, this is something that we, the United States, very much recognize. We need to update the Council to better reflect the makeup of the world today. And then finally, I think there's a fourth set that's really kind of cross-cutting issues that touch on all of the themes in the summit, and this is about prioritizing human rights, gender equality, reaffirming the important role of multi-stakeholders in these discussions, even if ultimately it's going to be an intergovernmentally negotiated process.
Thank you very much. I want to pick up on a couple of those things. First of all, on the human rights, and make a couple of comments, and then follow up with a couple of questions. On human rights, at least in my reading, the initial draft is relatively light, perhaps a little too light, I would imagine, from the U.S. perspective on and many like-minded countries on the issue of the human rights. The emergency platform is a very interesting one. I'd love to get your thoughts on, whether how that squares with member states' ideas about state sovereignty. I know that, and also its relationship with the Security Council. And then on the Security Council in particular, it's interesting to hear. I know obviously that was a leitmotif of President Biden's first speech to the UN General Assembly, and as you point out, it's a longer term process and has its own sort of negotiating track going on. But do you have any do you have any thoughts on in response to just what the nature of this emergency platform might actually look like? My understanding is that it would empower the UN Secretary-General to create a call together countries in an emergency basis when, say, the world was faced with another pandemic or some other similar shock.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Guy and his team put together a very useful policy brief to inform member state thinking and discussions on this. I think there are some member states that do have concerns about state sovereignty and where the boundary between this emergency platform ends, and some of the issues that the Council or indeed other UN bodies have responsibility for that we will need to navigate. I would say it is probably, certainly won't be the most contentious issue, but I think it's probably on a list of some of the trickier issues that we're going to need to navigate. I think from our perspective, if we look backwards, in many ways, we have the COVID response. While COVID is still with us, the pandemic is over. The WHO has declared it over. I think we've had the opportunity to reflect on what went right and many of the things that could have been done better. And the Secretary General has a very strong convening role. I think we see the emergency platform as a way of reaffirming that coordination role, perhaps giving him a bit more leverage the next time there is this type of a challenge, to be able to not only convene actors within the UN system, but to draw on regional organizations, the international financial institutions, member states, civil society, the private sector, to enable a more coordinated, more effective response.
Thank you. Mintu, the crisis of multilateralism is arguably more about actors in a sense than architecture. Obviously, in whenever you have a major UN reform effort, much of it will turn to what the instruments are at the disposal of the international body. But I guess one could argue that we've been brought to this point less about because of any sort of design flaws in the UN, so much as about those kind of narrowly self-interested decisions of sovereign UN member states. And if the UN is paralyzed and not fit for purpose, it's arguably the most powerful countries in the world and some of the regional blocs that might be to blame. I mean, would you share that assessment? And given that these current realities that we see out there, is there hope for meaningful accommodation between established and emerging powers, given the kind of east-west and north-south divisions that we're seeing today?
Yeah, thanks so much, Stuart. Great question. It's great to be here with Guy Ryder and Jake, too. I think what we're seeing is a crisis in legitimacy because the architecture reflects or doesn't reflect the actors that are emerging in terms of their, power in the world, and what they and the impact that these crises are having on them, and their inability to have a say in what happens. Jake mentioned Security Council reform, and the need to reflect it as the world today. And the world today is that many countries in the 193 don't really have much of a say in the kinds of things that are happening to them. You mentioned international financial architecture and the international financial institutions, and those decisions being made elsewhere outside of the UN. We should remember this is a summit of 193 world leaders. It's not a regular UN conference, but it is a summit where world leaders are coming together in September. And they are the same world leaders who are represented in the international financial institutions, in the World Bank and the G20, and in other places where these decisions are being made. And so I think when you look at actors across the world who are seeing where those decisions are made and saying, if we don't, if we're not able to have a greater say, then this is what's creating that crisis. So I think what's interesting about this is the kind of longstanding arguments that there are things that the UN can do, and there are things that other institutions should be doing. I think that's starting to fall apart, and that it's really about how do these actors assert themselves on the global stage. And if the only place that they have a voice is in the United Nations, at a world gathering of world leaders at a summit level, heads of state and government level, then this is the time for them to step up and vocalize that and send the political signals, so that then these other institutions or the ministers or ambassadors that are represented in these other institutions can then execute on. So I think the crisis of legitimacy is about actors, but it's also about how the architecture has reflected an old and now completely outdated view of the role that those actors can play. And so that's really what I think the opportunity here is for the summit. Now, obviously, the mandate of these other institutions for addressing issues around financial architecture are in other places. But as I said, I think, at the head of state level, I think this is a really important opportunity to send the right political signals. The other thing, just in terms of emerging powers, and I think, and Jake mentioned COVID. Coming out of COVID, we've seen the lack of solidarity between countries in COVID response. And, Guy Ryder mentioned that the origins of the Summit of the Future came during the COVID crisis in 2020. And what did we see then? The response around the world was that there are certain countries that are able to respond adequately, provide treatments and especially vaccinations for their own people, and there are countries that are not able to do that. And when you're talking about a global pandemic where the crisis doesn't stay within a border, doesn't stay just within the countries that are able to vaccinate their own people, then you really do have a crisis. And I think this is we're reaching a crisis point in how do we consider solidarity between countries? How do we consider the role or the responsibility that we have to other countries to solve these problems? And I think if the UN at this summit doesn't address that fundamental question, people are going to say it's not just the Ukraine crisis or what's going on in Gaza and Israel that's creating this crisis. There are a lot of people around the world, a lot of countries around the world that are looking to this moment and saying, if the UN can't do this, it will fail. And actually, those who really benefit from the UN will lose out.
That's a really fascinating distinction I think you were making between, in a sense, the UN as qua the UN versus sort of the UN as its member states and its leaders coming together. And, what you're suggesting is what the Secretary-General is in a sense doing is saying, look, we are bringing the world leaders together. We know that the governing boards of the World Bank, for instance, are not directly under the purview of the United Nations, et cetera, but those very same presidents and prime ministers and foreign ministers are going to be the ones who can then provide instructions to what needs to change within those organizations. I want to pick up a little bit, Mintu, on this kind of current difficult negotiating landscape, because one could think, partly the the title here is this the moment to renew global governance? And so the question is timing. I mean, a skeptic might say, wow, it's, this is the time to sort of, hang on by your fingernails as you're on the side of a cliff to sort of keep everything together. But other people say, a crisis is also a terrible thing to go to waste. I guess, given the complexities, I guess what I'd like to probe you a little bit is, how do you see the process and timeline going forward and the negotiating landscapes? 6 months is not a lot of time, obviously, to get something agreed that's tangible. As a guy already mentioned, there are a lot of different reform efforts underway. There's the climate negotiations. Obviously, there's the financing for development process. There's the reform of international financial institutions, the Bridgetown Agenda, the World Bank Evolution Roadmap, the Digital Compact, et cetera. And so it's important, obviously, for the Summit of the Future to try to plug into those things without necessarily replicating and invoke them without necessarily replicating everything. And then there's also going to be winners and losers, right? So when you look at the negotiating landscape, so that's not ideal, but it might provide some avenues for some form of grand bargain, particularly between the countries of the global south who have, you noted, have been dissatisfied with the sense that the wealthy world doesn't care about them. I mean, do you see opportunities between for some sort of level of accommodation amongst the, shall we say, grab bag of different proposals that are out there, whether on peace and security or financial architecture or climate, what have you?
Yeah. So you're absolutely right. This narrative that the world is way too divided for us to address the problems that we absolutely have to is actually, I think, pretty dangerous, because what are our options? Do we just throw up our hands in the air and say, okay, we're way too divided, let's just not do this? And I think the opportunity that the Secretary-General and the UN member states have provided here is, we're at a moment in crisis. The world is on fire. Do we have the courage to get together and figure out what we politically want to say about it and what we're going to decide, that then will have repercussions and hopefully, impacts in other places, as you say? I do think, we can turn crisis into opportunity. You had mentioned earlier about drawing potentially on, historical examples. I was just looking back to remind myself of the 2005 World Summit, and this was just after the Iraq War, when a coalition, without authorization from the Security Council, went into Iraq, and that created quite a crisis. And, eventually it led to the World Summit. And at the time, a lot of people said, the world is way too divided. You had one permanent member violating the UN Charter, and that created a crisis of legitimacy. Why have the UN Charter and, the rules that we have on use of force when it can apply in certain places and not in others? And of course, Bosnia and Rwanda had preceded that. But, we were able to then turn that crisis into an opportunity. I was looking to see what ended up happening in terms of the timeline of the negotiations, to your other point here. And in September of 2005, maybe this will give Guy and Jake, who are in the negotiating room, a little bit of ballast for their courage and having to face what will be coming in the next few months. But there were still 200 brackets in September. Brackets meaning unagreed language in September. And this was, the world's largest, or the largest gathering of world leaders in 2005 were coming that September, just a couple weeks later. And of course, you may remember this, that August, meaning just the month before, Ambassador John Bolton had been appointed on a recess appointment. And so that was part of the reason why this was kind of thrown into a sort of a chaotic situation. But just before that, we still had 200 brackets. And then, the president of the General Assembly and the member states said, somebody needs to pull a rabbit out of a hat. Maybe the co-facilitators and the secretariat and people can pull together based on what we know about positions and try to get a good summit outcome. And that's ended up being what happened. And the member states looked at the draft based on all of what we knew about positions at the time, and were able to come up with, I think, what was a pretty good, outcome. Now, what we didn't get there then, of course, was Security Council reform. So, I think we can see whether we have a better chance at it this time around. But we were able to turn crisis into opportunity at the time. And I think division creates more room for people to pay attention, for especially countries that have the most at stake, to say, even if this agenda is so vast, there's so many proposals and, you know, so many negotiators that we then have to deal with. This is just a massively complicated amount of ideas and work and kind of diplomatic work to be done, that they're waking up and saying, you know what, we have an opportunity right now with our heads of state coming to really create some change. Let's see how we can come together and figure it out, because otherwise we have no choice. Right now, the big divisions between the US and China, or Russia, you know, East, West, North, and South, it creates an opportunity for those countries who are, I would call them the kind of moderate middle, a group of small states expanding out, who can then form a coalition together with those who care about the system, who care about where the, you know, whether we're able to address these crises, come together and then figure out what the answer is. I actually am more optimistic than I was just a few months ago, because it seems to me like people are starting to pay attention and seeing that, you know, if you don't have a UN that can respond, then we're really in a world of hurt.
Thanks, Mintzu. I want to go back to Jake and then come back to Guy in a second. You know, I have to say, when I read the first draft of the document of the Pact for the Future, I was a little underwhelmed. I guess my general sense was that if you want to have a document that's about the future, you would probably want to have it be as compelling as possible, with a clear vision and bold priorities. And I found that our common agenda and our and the background papers that the Secretary-General had produced, perhaps Guy had a hand in this. I thought they were excellent, and I thought that they had some sort of far-leaning or forward-leaning and far-sighted recommendations. But I felt that I was a little underwhelmed, because I thought it was mostly sort of a cautious repetition of already agreed commitments. And so I'm wondering, you know, to the degree you can answer honestly here, you know, were there certain things that you would, in a sense, like to see more or perhaps less of in the current document? And how might these negotiations, do you think, also picking up on what I've talked with what Mintzu just mentioned, might begin to sort of span some of the divisions that you see in the negotiating process? I know that the United States and the Biden administration has made certainly rhetorical, and I think to some degree substantive, moves to try to engage countries of the so-called global majority or global South, and to try to say, look, we're on your side. But that's been an uneven results, I would say. So those two questions, sort of, how do you see the document as it currently stands now, and then what are prospects in certain areas maybe where there could be some common ground?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you're right. Okay, and I think in many ways the you know, I think actually a lot of credit is due to the German ambassador to the UN and the Namibian ambassador to the UN, both of whom are serving as the co-facilitators for this process. I think our common agenda did lay out a very ambitious, far-reaching agenda. Realistically, the sort of lack of ambition, I think, it's a common refrain about the first draft, and I think in some respect it emphasizes the lack of trust between within member states, and between member states and the UN. I think there's a lot of mutual suspicion about what it is we all want to get, and at whose expense. Now, if you take that as the starting point, and I mean, I've sat through hours and hours at this point of consultations. The COFAX held consultations with member states. They've held consultations with civil society and other stakeholders. And while it may not be the first draft that many of us were hoping for, I actually think it's a pretty good starting point. It's a good basis for negotiation in the sense that it's relatively balanced. It provides something to everyone with the understanding that, I think taking the United States, there's a lot of elements in there that we like. Could it have gone further in some areas? Of course. Are there some areas, some inclusions that we don't like? Of course. But we can try and work through that in the negotiations. And I think the co-facilitators were in a very difficult position of having to bridge awfully widely divergent views on complicated, contentious issues, including the balance between human rights and sustainable development, the role of human rights in peace and security, contested issues like climate related security and whether the UN Security Council or the Peace Building Commission has a role in that, or it should just be left to the UNFCCC. So a lot of big minefields, many of which have been with the organization in some cases for decades, over disarmament, over responsibility to protect, even over the extent to which civil society should be brought into intergovernmental negotiations. I think the co-facilitators have said, and many of us have affirmed, that we want a concise, future-focused, action-oriented pact for the future. And as I said, many of us think it needs to be more ambitious, but we all have different views on where it needs to be more ambitious and in what way it needs to be more ambitious. And I think similarly, a lot of us have said that the document needs to be more inspiring. It needs to be understandable and speak to the general public around the world. But it also needs to be intergovernmentally negotiated, and that brings to mind the 200 brackets that Mintu alluded to. I think we're way above 200 at the moment. And we're currently, as the co-facilitators put out a first draft, we're now doing the first reading of a 242-page compilation draft that reflects all of the member states' edits. So we've got a lot of work ahead of us to get back to something that is concise and action-oriented that'll really make a difference. But, honestly, I think probably there's broad consensus on 75, 80% of the text. There's a short list of issues that that are going to be really difficult, and I think ultimately will take up a lot of time. And again, there are issues that that we've grappled with before, most recently on the Sustainable Development Goal Summit political declaration just last September, but also on issues like nuclear non-proliferation and others. I think there's a path through the thicket, but it's we're going to get we're going to be a bit scuffed and bloody by the time we get out of it.
Thank you so much. You mentioned the future, and of course that this is the Summit of the Future and the Pact for the Future. Guy, one of the interesting things in the document, and I want to focus you on the future, is this Declaration on Future Generations, and I guess, or the provisions on future generations. Can you talk a little bit about what that actually entails in practice and why this is important to the Secretary-General and to the UN in general? And the other thing that I'd like to just press on is, well, actually, I'll come back to that. I'll save that thought. I'll just get you to answer this first.
Okay, and just before I go to that specific point, if I may, Stuart, just to reflect on what Jake said, because I agree very much with what he's just said. I think there's something important to say here. With the publication of the zero draft of the Pact, if you like, it was a point of inflection where the material went from being what the Secretariat, what the Secretary-General was putting on the table in those policy papers in the course of last year to the member states' consideration of those proposals. Now, I don't think it's a secret. When the Secretary-General was preparing his positions and his proposals, he told the pen holders here in the building, right at the level of ambition of what we think needs to be done, what I think needs to be done as Secretary-General, not at what we think member states will be in a position to reach consensus upon. And I think it's important that we say that because there's going to be a natural process of digestion now amongst member states, which is going to take us into a slightly different process. I want to echo what Jake has said in appreciation of the job done by our German and Namibian colleagues as co-facilitators, because they did what they had to do, which was bring together what they'd heard from member states in this initial consultative process and produced what is, I think, by common acknowledgement, a balanced and solid starting point. And I think everybody recognizes that. And it's important for the integrity of the onward process that confidence and that recognition is there. The question is, what do we do with it now? And I hear in the same breath as our member states are saying balanced, solid, good starting point. Yeah, concise, action-oriented, more ambitious, and accessible. And we've got to find our way to square those circles. I actually think it can be done. I think there are, to revert to what the question you put them into earlier on, the breadth of the subject matter contained in the draft pact is so broad that there is obvious scope for trade-offs, for quid pro quos to be brought into this. So as Jake has said, we're going to have to fight our way through the thickets, but we've got the means to do it. So at this point, 242 pages of comments notwithstanding, I think we can get there. Now, what about this piece on youth and future generations? Our member states decided that one of the 5 chapters of this pact should be dedicated indeed to youth and to future generations. Youth, I think, is not the subject of your question directly, but this is about how young people can participate more meaningfully in the work of the United Nations. A lot to be said about that. But future generations is qualitatively a different thing. This is not about the young people who are with us today. It's about the 10 billion people as yet unborn who will be born before the end of this century. And the question posed is, what are the responsibilities of policymakers, decision makers today towards those future generations as yet unborn? And the idea is to codify our thinking in that regard in a declaration on future generations that would be annexed to the body of the Pact. And it's quite interesting listening to colleagues in this regard. In a sense, it's adding a new dimension, a new responsibility to policy making. It's not simply about young people. It's adding a different sort of methodology, foresight perspective to decision making. Some interesting things about that. Firstly, as we prepared the Secretary-General's proposals in this regard, we uncovered that a very high proportion, a very considerable proportion of our member states actually have in place arrangements requiring their legislatures to take into account the impact on future generations. So we're not starting from zero. We're able to build on quite a lot of national experience in that regard. And then I think it's not a philosophical, it's a very practical question, but one we're going to come up against quite quickly. Now, when we look to our responsibilities to future generations, is this about assessing and managing risks that we could impose upon them? Or is it about positioning our decision-making processes to actually uncover and exploit new opportunities? And I think we need to take, in my view at least, that rather pro-positive attitude. We're not just protecting them from the worst outcomes of the things we could get wrong today. It's about something much more positive than that. And one thinks of technology, one thinks about the positive pieces of transition to climate neutrality. And we can actually have this as the sort of declaration that would actually outline what we need to do, to actually keep intact that dream of a future which is going to be better for future generations than it has been perhaps for past ones and for current ones as well. There's ancillary proposals around on future generations. One is that a special envoy might be established for future generations. In fact, that would fall within the authority of the Secretary-General to do, and that some sort of forum at the UN Intergovernmental Forum might be put in place also to consider these issues. But what I want to say is, I don't think this should be seen as a sideshow just to plug on. It looks good in a future summit to have something about future generations. I actually think this goes to the heart of how we do our decision making across the substantive board in the multilateral system.
In terms of thinking about the future, is there a danger in a sense of setting up, guys, is there a danger of setting up the UN for failure in thinking about this, if we think about this as, in a sense, a one and done? That, in other words, that this summit of the future will occur and everything must, in a sense, be agreed to then, and that will send us on, in a sense, on our merry way. I wonder whether or not there has been thought given either within the Secretariat or UN member states of framing this as, in a sense, the beginning of a longer process that will unfold over the next several years, so that the timeline doesn't seem quite as unrealistic. And there's so much good stuff or compelling material being put on the table for consideration by member states. But obviously we know that there's not going to be, no single summit can actually possibly deliver on massive expectations about the future. Is there thought within the Secretariat about framing this event to help, make it have long-term impact?
I can answer that very quickly if you're looking in my direction.
Sure, yes, I'm sorry, Guy, yeah, sure.
Definitely the thinking is there. I mean, it's clear that this summit, let's hope it's successful. A successful summit will not be the last word on the issues being addressed. It's probably the first word, or it's a moment which would set in train a whole series of processes that would need to be worked upon, in coming years. And I think that applies across the different chapters. Certainly it applies to issues such as Security Council reform and other areas of governance. It would apply, I think, to what is going to be an ongoing conversation about the future of the international financial system and what role the UN should have in that broader set of responsibilities. I think it's also true of technology governance, artificial intelligence. I think almost by definition, it is clear that this is not just a once-off moment and we can go back to business as it previously was. And there are some built-in processes that we can already look forward to take a successful summit conclusion forward. There is a World Social Summit now mandated as of yesterday for 2025. We have a Financing for Development conference coming up. So I think really, I think it's quite clear to all. We have to make it work, of course, but I think the proposition has to be that we are at a starting gate and the start of processes which will serve multilateralism, give direction to multilateral endeavors in the future, not just a moment to be lived and then left behind us.
Can I turn, and you anticipated my last, the question I was going to ask, which was, Guy, which is, what would constitute success for the summit? And part of what the answer clearly is that it is kicking off processes that will then come to fruition in coming years. But it's getting, in a sense, member states committed to proceed down a particular path. Jake, do you have the thoughts from a U.S. perspective of what success might look like?
Yeah, I think ultimately a successful summit has to articulate a clear vision of what the role, or what member states' vision of the role of the UN is in addressing international challenges and opportunities that we face today, and at least in the near future, and offer both a clear set of short-term immediate reforms, but as Guy said, sets a pathway for a longer process of renewal of the UN to make sure that it continues to be relevant and have value. So I think the summit it's partly about reform, about updating institutions to enable it to better respond to new and old challenges. But it's also about signaling. It's about demonstrating the continued value of the United Nations, and demonstrating that the organization, an organization that was created in 1946, is capable of reform and is able to adapt to address those challenges and concerns that are first and foremost on the minds of people in countries around the world, often in very different situations. Enabling sustainable development, realizing human rights, preventing and ending conflict, combating and responding to climate change, addressing humanitarian crises. And I think a big part of that, as we've spoken about, is also demonstrating that those decision-making processes are open to reform, and that there is a bigger tent, both in the sense that it 193 member states, unlike the numbers we were talking about when the organization was created, but a bigger tent in the way that I think Mintu was alluding to as well. We're on so many issues. This is no longer just about member states. I think outer space or digital technology is an excellent example where most of the capability, most of the expertise no longer sits with member states. It sits with the private sector. It sits with academia. It sits with civil society. So we need to find a constructive way to bring that wider set of actors in and provide the expertise that we as member states need to make informed decisions. And I think there is an unfortunate tendency as diplomats, when we can't agree on something, to revert to the previously agreed language from the last time we picked up an issue. I think success in part is having a pact that is not just a restatement of previously agreed language and old commitments, but actually moves the needle forward and addresses what we've been talking about, in part because for many of these issues, there is no agreed language. The US right now has been running a resolution in the General Assembly on artificial intelligence. It's a new issue. The General Assembly has never taken up this issue. So we need to come up with new language to address what is, for the organization, a new issue. And I think finally, success is strengthening the moral authority of the Secretary-General. Ultimately, the UN matters, but the role of the Secretary-General as the head of the United Nations authority, he has used that extremely effectively in shaping the narrative on international financial architecture reform. We would certainly argue that he has an incredibly important role in conflict prevention and conflict resolution. So I think a pact and a summit that elevates the role of the Secretary-General, not just the organization, would be an important mark of success.
Jake, I know you need to leave in a few minutes to go to the negotiations. You'll be taking off a little bit earlier than our other two panelists. But let me take the opportunity then to ask you something about what you said about the continued value of the United Nations, and that needs to be demonstrated to member states. It also needs to be demonstrated, not least of all, to the United States and to the American public. It's no secret that there's been a lot of oscillations in U.S. Attitudes and posture towards the UN. It's conceivable there will be another one, depending on the outcome of this November's election. How do you think, and presumably you do spend a lot of time thinking about this, how can the United Nations be communicated as something that's actually in the interests of the American public? And do you give any thoughts to, how, generally speaking, the UN can be framed as something that actually engages with Americans and American interests and American values as well on every single day, including in this reform process?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the United States had an outsized role in creating the United Nations after World War II. I mean, it is hardwired into American norms and values are hardwired into the United Nations. And yes, it is an organization of 193 member states. In the General Assembly, the United States is one among equals. We are an incredibly influential equal. And I think we continue to have an outsized role in shaping the agenda of the United Nations in a way that the United Nations can be an extremely important tool for not only reaffirming many of the values, human rights, democracy, good governance, gender equality that I think are near and dear to American society, but it also helps affirm our place in the world. We if you believe in soft power, and I do, I think the United Nations is a place where we are able to further our foreign policy goals, our national security goals. We are able to it helps keep the American people safe. It something like UN peacekeeping. It gives us a tool to help resolve conflicts in areas that we care about without having to send American boots on the ground. I think the organization's support for sustainable development in the long run benefits all of us. I mean, particularly if you think about the migration crisis at the southern border of the United States right now. So there is, as you said, there is a long-standing strain, I think, within the United States that is skeptical of the United Nations, of the idea of giving up some of our sovereignty. I think it's important to remember that giving up some of our sovereignty, everybody does, and that's actually a way of keeping others in check. It's about reaffirming a rules-based international order that is intended to set a level playing field and provide established rules of the road that everybody needs to follow.
Thank you very much. No, I really appreciate that answer very much. Mintu, let me turn to you about from your perspective. What does success look like? How would you define it? And what could our expectations for this event be?
Yeah, thanks. Just coming off of what Jake said in terms of the importance that the major power in the world places on the UN. If a country like the US sees the benefit in a capable UN that can deliver, then can you imagine what the rest of the world, countries in the rest of the world, the stake that they have in a working UN? And I think that's really where we need to. So if I think about success for the summit, is the UN, and are we as a global community able to cooperate to solve the biggest problems that we're having to face right now? People look at the world on fire, Ukraine, humanitarian crises around the world, Sudan. I mean, climate change. I mean, it feels like there is a simultaneously so many problems in the world. And people say, I was just watching something from Jon Stewart last night. This is the comedian, but just saying the world is on fire, and then you look to the UN and it's not doing anything. And I think, so the number one I think, measure for whether this summit is successful is, are we answering that call? Have we made some move to say, yes, we hear you. Yes, we see the world's on fire. And here's what we're going to try to do about it. And it's not going to be the be all, where September is the grand finale of the solution for this, but it should set out the blueprint for all the work that we have ahead. So, if I think about success, and, Jake mentioned some of the old stuff, some of the new stuff, I started to think, gosh, what's a framework for managing all of the issues that are on the table that we're trying to address? And the best I could come up with is just a kind of a clarifying way of thinking about it, was that kind of old wedding adage, that brides, for an auspicious start to their marriage, should wear something old, something new, something borrowed, and something hopefully UN blue. So, the something old is, can we just reaffirm territorial sovereignty, the illegality of use of force? War has been illegal except for very, very limited circumstances, and the only body that can authorize legal use of force is the Security Council, which is in the UN. So international humanitarian law, the kind of Geneva Conventions, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Let's just reaffirm those things that the world looks to the UN to do. I mean, if a comedian knows those basics of that's where we should be looking, the UN should be doing these things, and it doesn't. If the summit doesn't answer that call, I think we're really in a lot of trouble. The something new is a lot of the things that have just been discussed here. Guy Ryder mentioned the orientation towards the future and really taking that on in a meaningful way. That is something really remarkable and new. I've heard people scoff at the summit of the future. What does that even mean? It sounds so unreal and kind of like a science fiction novel. But we really do mean, how do we take into account the future generations and our responsibility, the decisions that we make today, and the impact that that's going to have on future generations? We should be stewards for this. And that is actually a really exciting and inspiring vision. It sets a blueprint for how we should think about our cooperation, our responsibility to one another. So I think, and the something new, I'd also say, just, in terms of geopolitics around the world, is, is there a principle around giving voice to those who are most impacted? Something like a nothing about us without us principle. We don't have to figure out all the machinery and, to make that happen, but a principle, kind of like in the Sustainable Development Goals, there was a principle of leave no one behind, that then set us on a course for how we measure data, where we should be steering our delivery of, development assistance and that sort of thing. So is there a principle like nothing about us without us that starts to steer us towards how do we bring in those voices who are really impacted, who can have a part in the solutions that we need to see? There's something borrowed is there's all these things that are happening. We talked about this in terms of international financial institutions and the international financial architecture, but there are a lot of things that are happening in other places. Can the heads of state convening at the UN borrow some of that for just a moment to send the right political signals that can then, be executed over the next few months, coming years? And then the something blue is all the really important stuff around something meaningful on Security Council, something meaningful on really getting the UN to do better on prevention, conflict mediation, delivery of services, the emergency platform, the kind of basic management sort of reforms that need to happen to keep the UN fit for purpose. So if you kind of think about those buckets, I think success for me is we've got to have something really substantial within that, and accountability measures. So, for violations, a kind of independent review to make sure that we're actually doing what we say we do.
I love reframing the summit for the future, or summit of the future, as a wedding, and it's a wonderful metaphor. Actually, I think it's genius. So copyright that, Guy. You've heard Jake speak a bit, and then Mintu with that just wonderful analogy. Are there things you'd like to add on anything that they've said? I have a couple of other questions, otherwise, in my pocket for you, but go ahead.
Yeah, let me just reflect, or just sort of comment on the things I've heard both from Jake and Mintu. Starting off by saying I didn't hear anything I disagree with, so this could be rather boring, but let me just make a couple of points. You don't have to be a US citizen. You don't have even to be a staff member at the United Nations to recognize the fundamental importance of United States engagement and leadership in the international community. I mean, that's been the experience of my generation and my parents' generation. And that leads me to the first point of what we need to expect from this summit. It disturbs me that there is a narrative out there, is there not, that pursuit of the national interest is antithetical to engagement, investment in multilateral process. I'm a Brit. When we left the European Union, the campaign to leave the European Union was take back control, as if engagement in a international or regional arena was axiomatically limiting one's capacity to pursue the national interest. I think we have to turn that on its head. That is to say that in any country, big or small, developed or developing, the national interest can only be served through engagement in international processes, multilateral processes. Why? Because the natures of the challenges that we face are only capable of being resolved through such international processes. And then you've got to give a bit of concrete to that rather than have it as a philosophical proposition. And that's the second thing which I think the summit must do. It really does have to render the United Nations more capable of dealing with these crises, these problems, in a way which produces results that people can see. I'm afraid the most visible image of the United Nations in the media these days, or in public space, is, well, the Security Council hasn't been capable of coming up with a position. We haven't really been able to stop conflicts in different parts of the world. So, the Secretary-General, again, has sort of teed up this summit saying we need to render multilateralism more effective as well as more inclusive and more networked. And I think it's terribly important. I also think that I like the phrase that Jake used about signaling. I think this summit has to signal that the United Nations is capable of an exercise of self-reflection. There's a saying that the non-reflecting life is not worth living. An institution that's not capable of considering itself in a critical light and drawing conclusions from it is probably not got a very bright future ahead of it. We need to be able to reflect on what we do well, what we don't do well. And then I hope, this is more subjective than objective, and it's through the process as much as the outcome of this summit, begin to restore trust, begin to rebuild. There is no diktat for this. We have to rebuild a notion of trust and common purpose in the work that we do. So I really think that these are underpinning the substantive chapters of the Pact, some of the thoughts that we need to try to bring to the surface if we're going to be able to win the support, not just of the United States, but of the leaders, the political leaders and public opinion of our member states. And it's no small thing.
To pick up on your point about turning things on their head, I read a book on U.S. sovereignty and international cooperation called The Sovereignty Wars. And the thesis of that was, in a world of interdependence, if sovereignty is about your ability to determine your fate as a nation, then multilateral cooperation is an expression and embodiment of sovereignty, provided it's done according to constitutional provisions. And that is something that bears repeating over and over again. It doesn't mean that every form of multilateral cooperation is right. It doesn't mean that you shouldn't look at the details of what a multilateral deal is. But it does suggest that it's the only alternative to attempting, often futilely, to do everything yourself at enormous expense. You did mention networked multilateralism, Guy, and I wanted to pick up on that a little bit, because Jake had also said, look, we have all of so many of these tools. For instance, if you look at artificial intelligence, for instance, are in the hands of international corporations. Or if you look at humanitarian assistance, so much of the action is actually done by non-governmental organizations and service providers. How does the Summit of the Future, and conceivably the Pact for the Future, deal with the issue of expanding who's at the table? because it's not it's intuitively attractive, but it's not self-evident always how to do so in a way that's politically legitimate. Because of course, at least the sovereign member states are in a sense duly constituted as members of international society, and individuals too have rights under international law. But it gets a little trickier with civil society actors and corporations, and yet you want to leverage them because they're part of the solution. Is there a lot of thinking in advance of this Summit of the Future about how the UN might do this more effectively?
Yeah. Again, the short answer to your question is yes, there's a great deal of thinking, but the sort of background music to that thinking, I think it is fair to say, Stuart, there is a permanent tension, I think, in these processes between those of our member states who insist very, very strongly on the exclusively intergovernmental nature of the process. That is to say, the United Nations is a place where, as you've indicated, people holding a national mandate, governments holding a national mandate, come together and are free to decide what they want to do. And everything that interferes, if you like, or impinges on that space is in one way or another problematic. So you get this tension between the intergovernmental nature of the UN, which of course in decision making is a reality, and the extent to which we can involve other stakeholders, be they from civil society, at the risk of simplifying things, or from the private commercial sector come in. Our Secretary-General is convinced and says repeatedly that whilst, of course, one respects the intergovernmental nature of the process, decision-making can only be improved by listening to other stakeholders. So that's in the decision-making process. And then in the implementational process, I mean, it's self-evident that in today's world, and by the way, this was made very explicit when we set the 2030 agenda in motion back in 2015, it was clear that you are never going to get the development outcomes that we want unless the private sector is harnessed to the effort. We have to align private sector efforts to the publicly set objectives. And this is, what is behind the notion of networked. By the way, it's also the notion of making the different component parts of the UN system work together a little bit better. We're sometimes guilty of silo dwelling, and there's no doubt about that. So that's the other part of networking. And so part of Our Common Agenda report, part of the Summit of the Future, is also getting other very important constituent bodies involved. So the Secretary-General has set up an advisory board of local and regional governments and cities. We need them to play their part in the multilateral agenda. Putting in place a new scientific advisory board. Now, we're wrestling with the challenges of new technologies. This is a preeminently expert area, where we need the knowledge and the insights of the scientists who are making all of this happen. So we've got to really find ways of bringing all of that together. Here again, I just want to repeat, we are absolutely committed. We'll have a major civil society conference in Nairobi in May to making sure that this multi-stakeholder outreach is as wide as we can possibly make it, without, of course, simply turning our back on some of the sensitivities which you've rightly pointed to.
Thank you. Mintu, can I turn things to the last word over to you? And I'm particularly interested in your thoughts about, because you've been very engaged in the UN system, both inside and out, about the role of external actors and how you've seen that change over time in terms of, hopefully pressing UN reform efforts in a productive direction and bringing along a more inclusive multilateralism.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. I think, just to what Guy Ryder was saying about networked multilateralism, I think about, the most recent kind of big global agreement on the Sustainable Development Goals, where we couldn't have gotten the SDGs and the kind of buy-in for that if it hadn't been for the massively, activist sort of civil society, NGO groups who had been working on the Millennium Development Goals for a long time, were taking what they knew the knowledge that they had gained about what worked and what didn't work, and then bringing that to bear on the Sustainable Development Goals, and then also bringing up the equity issues and saying this can't just be an agenda for developing countries, because if it's just developing countries taking on the burden, then we're never going to get there. We actually also need to have donor countries and northern countries who have the wherewithal to contribute to, and that's why the SDGs are a universal agenda. So the role of outside actors, in particular civil society groups who really have adopted the ideals of the UN on human rights, on humanitarian issues, they have such an important role to play in informing member states. I mentioned before that a lot of small states just don't have the capacity to follow these issues, to get guidance from their capitals on such a broad range of topics. But there are a lot of civil society groups, and especially think tanks like Carnegie and others, who have expertise that align with the interests of some of these governments and can then support them. But, at the end of the day, the decisions have to be made by the member states. The world is still a state-based system, and I think rightfully so, because we have to organize ourselves in a certain way, and there are governments who have to be represented in this global forum. But being able to listen to and bring in those perspectives on what a global agenda like this should look like, and especially then how the execution, the implementation should be done, is really important. I think there is understandably concern around, are there certain interests that will override the sort of interests of the global public or public goods and that sort of thing. I think those are really important tensions to understand. My way of kind of, there are examples in the World Health Organization, in other places, in technical bodies, where we found a way to allow outside groups to provide their expertise, even private sector groups provide their expertise without and still being able to manage some of the potential, issues that have come up. So I think the way that if we're going to address these big global problems, there's no way that governments can do them on their own, either coming up with the agenda and especially in just making it all happen. So how do you set something up where there's as much buy-in as possible, where you've consulted and really brought in the perspectives of those who really understand the way that marginalized groups are, experiencing, and then, allowing them to have a say so that then we have a better outcome at the end. And that's really what I think networked multilateralism is about. And it's really great to see that that's started to get us some great outcomes here.
Thank you so much. I want to express my appreciation to Guy Ryder and Mintu Pham. Thank you so much for joining us, and also obviously to Jake Sherman, who had to step out to engage in negotiations on this very topic. But I hope we have a lot of future opportunities to chat with each other. And Guy, best of luck in shepherding things over the next 6 months. We'll be interested observers and occasional commentators. Hopefully you'll take our critiques and comments with the right spirit in which they're intended. But no, it was a great pleasure to be able to host this. So thank you all very much, and thank you all for joining who are online.
Thank you.